Welcome to the Deep Dive, where I uploaded my transcript for the podcast and have two AI hosts talk about it. They may go into more depth than I went into. So without further ado, here's the Deep Dive.
Welcome back, everybody, to another Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at something a little bit different than what we've looked at before: interpersonal exploitation. Now, we're going to be basing this deep dive on an audio series called Interpersonal Exploitation, The Why of Things. And in particular, today we're going to be focusing on part 10 out of 15. So we've got a lot of material to get through, but hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have a better grasp on just what exactly interpersonal exploitation is, why people would even do it in the first place, and of course, what you can actually do about it. So let's get started.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is that a lot of people who are experiencing interpersonal exploitation don't even know that it's happening to them. And so one of the goals of this deep dive is to really shine a light on this phenomenon and to help people understand how to recognize it and how to protect themselves.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. How does this audio series actually define interpersonal exploitation?
Well, it's interesting. They define it pretty simply, and I actually like that. They basically say it's just like when someone's taking advantage of you, right? And they're doing it purely for their own benefit. They don't really care about the impact it has on you or the consequences for you. And so they really just kind of look at the relationship as like a transaction for them. So it's like they're getting their needs met, whether that's attention, favors, validation, whatever it is they need. But your needs are completely irrelevant in their view.
So it's like they're using other people like tools just to get what they want.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. That's a pretty stark contrast to a healthy relationship, where it's more of the two-way street.
Oh, absolutely. In a healthy relationship, there's this mutual respect, there's care, there's give and take. Both people are invested in the well-being of each other. It's not just one person constantly taking and the other one constantly giving. Yeah.
Now, the audio series actually makes this distinction between asking for help, which is something we all do, versus exploitation. So how do they explain that difference?
Yeah, it's a really important difference to point out because we all need help sometimes, right? And it's totally normal and healthy to ask for help from people we trust. But the difference is that in a healthy relationship, when you ask for help, there's this underlying understanding of reciprocity, that you're also there to support the other person when they need help, and that you're not just constantly taking without giving anything back.
So it's really about the balance and the intention behind the request, right?
Absolutely. In an exploitative relationship, the person who's doing the taking, they just keep taking without any thought or care for the impact it's having on the other person. There's no sense of like, oh, I should probably give something back to this person who's constantly supporting me.
Right. So we've established that exploitation is this one-sided thing. It's all take and no give. But why would someone even do that?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
What's going on in their head?
Well, the audio series points to a few key factors, and they say that, it can be a combination of entitlement, a lack of empathy, and this kind of hyper-focus on personal gain.
So it's like their internal compass is just totally skewed.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Like it's all about me, and everyone else is just
a pawn in their game.
Yeah, a means to an end.
Right, and the series goes on to explain that the reasons why someone might end up with these traits, this lack of empathy and entitlement and so on, can actually be linked to different personality disorders, which I know we're going to talk about a bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of this audio series, and I think it's really helpful to kind of connect those dots, like how these personality disorders can manifest in these exploitative behaviors.
Yeah, and I think what's important to remember is that regardless of the specific disorder, there's often this underlying disregard for the needs and feelings of others.
Okay, that makes sense. So speaking of personality disorders, the audio series dives into 4 specific types that fall under this umbrella of what psychologists call cluster B. And I have to admit, those names can be a little bit intimidating.
Yeah.
But thankfully, this series uses some helpful acronyms, which I think is really smart.
It definitely makes it easier to remember and to wrap your head around it all.
Yeah, for sure. So the first one that kind of jumps out to me is ID, which stands for Impulsive Disregard Disorder. They also point out that this is sometimes referred to as antisocial personality disorder. So what does that impulsive disregard actually look like in real life?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, you can think about it as like People who have this disorder, they act without thinking about the consequences, right? And particularly without thinking about the consequences for other people. They're really driven by their own impulses and desires, and they have a really, really hard time connecting with other people on an emotional level.
So it's more than just being like selfish. It's like there's a fundamental disconnect in the way they relate to other people. And I can see how that could easily lead to exploitation, because if you don't see other people as fully human with their own needs and feelings, then it's easy to just use them to get what you want.
Exactly. And what makes it even more complicated is that people with ID are often very manipulative and charming. They can be very good at getting people to do what they want, so it can be hard to spot them.
Yeah, that's scary.
Right. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
And for the person on the receiving end of this, I imagine it can be incredibly damaging. Like to be constantly manipulated and used without any consideration for your feelings.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine constantly feeling like you're being taken advantage of, like your needs are never a priority, and that you're just being used to get what someone else wants. It can really erode your self-esteem, make you start questioning your own judgment.
Yeah. Like you might even start blaming yourself.
Oh, yeah.
For being taken advantage of.
Exactly. And that's one of the really insidious things about exploitation, is that it often makes the victim feel like they're the one at fault.
Right. Like there's something wrong with them.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that it's not your fault. The exploiter is the one who's responsible for their actions.
Okay, that's a really important reminder. So I've talked about ID, and the next one on the list is ESFD, Extreme Self-Focused Disorder, which is also known as Narcissistic Personality Disorder. Now, I feel like I've heard the term narcissist thrown around a lot these days, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Yeah, I think narcissist has become a bit of a buzzword, but it's important to understand what it actually means clinically. So people with ESFD, they have this overwhelming need to be admired and validated by others. They have this inflated sense of self-importance, and they often exploit others to feed that need.
So it's not just about being vain, it's like a much deeper issue, where their whole sense of self is dependent on this external validation.
Exactly. And they can be very charming and charismatic, which makes it easy for people to get swept up in their world. But the problem is they're not genuinely interested in you as a person. They're only interested in what you can do for them, how you can boost their ego.
Oh, wow.
Right. So you might feel like you're in a close relationship with someone with ESFD, but ultimately they're just using you to prop up their own fragile sense of self.
And what about the people who are caught in that web? How does it feel to be on the receiving end of that kind of exploitation?
Well, I think it can be really painful to realize that you were only valued for what you could offer someone, not for who you are as a person. It's like you were just a tool to be used and then discarded when you were no longer useful.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly hurtful.
It is, and it can leave you feeling very confused and betrayed, because they can be so good at making you feel special and important when they need something from you.
Right, like they can turn on the charm.
Exactly. So it can be hard to see the manipulation until it's too late.
Okay, so that's ESFD, and the next one on the list is EID, which stands for Emotional Intensity Disorder. And the series points out that this is also known as borderline personality disorder. Now, I'm kind of curious about this one because it seems, I don't know, maybe less intentionally malicious than the first two.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And you're right, there is a nuance there. People with EID, they don't typically set out to exploit others in the same way that someone with ID or ESFD might.
It's not like a calculated plan.
Right. It's more that their own intense emotions and neediness can lead to exploitative behavior. So they might be constantly seeking reassurance, validation, and attention, often to a degree that feels really overwhelming to the other person.
So it's less about a conscious decision to take advantage of someone and more about this desperate need for emotional support, even if it comes at the expense of others.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
It's like they're so consumed by their own emotional needs that they don't even realize they're draining other people in the process.
Exactly. And it can be hard to set boundaries with someone with EID because their emotional reactions can be so intense.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be really challenging.
You might feel guilty for trying to protect your own space, even if you're feeling completely depleted.
Right. Like you don't want to abandon them when they're feeling so vulnerable.
Exactly.
But at the same time, you can't sacrifice your own well-being.
Right. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, let's move on to the last one, which is DASD, which stands for Traumatic Attention-Seeking Disorder, also sometimes called Histrionic Personality Disorder. So what's kind of the defining characteristic of this one?
Well, with DISD, it's all about being the center of attention. Like they crave it, they need it, and they'll go to great lengths to get it, even if it means using and manipulating other people.
So they're like the ultimate drama queen or king.
Exactly. Always putting on a show, demanding an audience.
And how does that lead to exploitation?
Well, they might use charm, exaggeration, or even fabricated stories to draw people in and keep the spotlight on them. And they're not really concerned with the impact that their behavior has on others as long as they're getting the attention they crave.
So it's like everyone else is just a prop in their play.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I imagine that can be very damaging to the people around them.
It can be. It can feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells, never knowing what's going to set them off, and always feeling like you're in the supporting role to their lead performance.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here, talking about these 4 different personality disorders that can contribute to exploitative behavior. And I don't know about you, but I'm suddenly feeling very aware of my own relationship boundaries.
That's a good thing. Being aware of these patterns is the first step in protecting yourself from exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into the how-to of protecting ourselves, I think it's important to really understand the impact of being on the receiving end of this kind of behavior.
You're absolutely right.
Because I think sometimes people underestimate the emotional toll it can take.
Yeah, and the audio series, it actually does a really good job of describing this. They talk about the feelings of being used and unappreciated, betrayed, and all these really heavy emotions that can weigh you down.
And I imagine it can really do a number on your self-esteem and sense of worth.
Oh, absolutely. It can really shake your foundation in terms of how you see yourself and how you relate to other people.
Yeah, like it can make you doubt your own instincts and your ability to judge people accurately.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to talk about how to protect yourself. Because the good news is there are things you can do to prevent this from happening and to heal if you've already been affected by it.
That's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned. All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. In the last part, we were talking about all those different personality disorders and how they can contribute to interpersonal exploitation. And yeah, it got pretty heavy there at the end.
It did.
So how do we even start to protect ourselves from this?
Right. Well, I think the audio series actually gives some really good advice on this. And it really boils down to 2 key things. One is setting boundaries. And the other is recognizing that healthy relationships are a 2-way street.
Okay. That makes sense in theory, but what does that actually look like in real life?
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. Like, it's one thing to say set boundaries, but it's another thing to actually do it.
Right. It can be hard to know where to draw the line.
Exactly. So I think the first step is to really tune into your own needs and feelings. What are you comfortable with? What are your limits?
So it's about being honest with yourself about what you're willing to tolerate.
Exactly.
And what you're absolutely not okay with.
Yeah. It's about knowing your worth and demanding respect. If someone's consistently disregarding your needs, taking without giving, leaving you feeling drained and depleted, that's a huge red flag.
Okay, so I'm hearing that no is a complete sentence?
Yes.
You don't need to over-explain or justify your boundary?
Exactly. It's about respecting yourself enough to say, this isn't okay with me, even if it means disappointing the other person.
Yeah. But what if they push back? What if they try to guilt you or manipulate you into giving in?
That's where it gets even more important to stand your ground. Remember, you are not responsible for their feelings or their reactions. You have the right to protect yourself, even if it means saying no to someone you care about.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm.
Exactly. And setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's not controlling. It's actually an act of self-respect.
Yeah.
And it's essential for creating healthy, sustainable relationships.
Okay, so let's say I've set some boundaries, but the other person just keeps pushing them. What if they just continue to exploit me?
Well, then it might be time to consider taking a step back from the relationship, or even walking away.
Ooh, that's tough.
It can be a really hard decision. But sometimes it's the healthiest and most empowering choice you can make. You deserve to be in relationships where you feel safe, respected, and appreciated. If someone's consistently violating your boundaries and disregarding your well-being, walking away might be the best way to protect yourself.
Yeah, it's like ripping off a Band-Aid. It might sting in the moment, but ultimately it's the best thing for your long-term healing.
That's a great analogy. And walking away doesn't mean you're cold-hearted or unforgiving. It simply means that you're choosing to prioritize your own well-being.
Okay, so this is all great advice, but I have to admit, it can feel a little overwhelming. Like, where do you even begin to apply all of this?
Yeah, I get it. I think one practical step you can take is to start paying attention to the patterns in your relationships. Ask yourself, do you consistently feel depleted or drained after interacting with certain people?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I'm already thinking of a few people who fit that description.
Right.
It's not about labeling people or making judgments.
No, not at all. It's just about noticing the impact that different relationships have on your energy and your well-being.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm paying attention to my energy levels and whether my needs are being met. What else should I be looking out for?
Another good question to ask yourself is, do you feel pressured to give more than you receive in certain relationships?
That's interesting. I think a lot of us, myself included, can kind of fall into that trap of people-pleasing without even realizing it.
Oh, absolutely. It's so common, especially for people who are naturally empathetic and caring. But it's important to remember that you deserve to be in relationships where there's a balance of giving and receiving.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Right.
Okay, so I'm starting to get a clearer picture of what healthy boundaries look like.
Yeah.
But what about self-care? The audio series mentions that it's a key part of protection. So what role does self-care play in all of this?
Self-care is so important, especially when you're dealing with exploitation. It's about replenishing your own energy, nurturing your emotional well-being, reminding yourself that you are worthy of love and care.
So even amidst all the chaos and drama, you have to remember to take care of yourself.
Exactly. Self-care isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. It's like putting on your own oxygen mask first before helping others. You can't pour from an empty cup.
That's such a great metaphor. But what does self-care actually look like?
It can be anything that nourishes your mind, body, and soul. Spending time in nature, practicing mindfulness, pursuing creative hobbies, or even just taking a long, relaxing bath.
So it's not about being selfish. It's about being intentional about your own well-being.
Exactly. And remember, self-care isn't a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of prioritizing your own needs and making choices that support your physical, emotional, and mental health.
Okay, so we've talked about setting boundaries, walking away when necessary, and practicing self-care. Are there any other strategies for dealing with interpersonal exploitation, like anything else we could do to protect ourselves?
Well, I think one of the most powerful tools you have at your disposal is awareness. The more you understand about these dynamics, the better equipped you'll be to recognize them and protect yourself.
So knowledge is power.
Absolutely. By educating yourself about the different types of exploitation, the motivations behind them, the tactics used by exploiters, you'll be more likely to spot the red flags early on.
And the earlier you spot them, the better your chances of avoiding getting caught in that web.
Exactly. It's like having a radar system that can detect potential danger before it's too late.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
So we're not just victims waiting to be taken advantage of. We have the power to educate ourselves and protect ourselves.
Exactly. And that empowerment is key to breaking free from exploitative dynamics and creating healthy, fulfilling relationships.
I love that. So we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the different types of exploitation, the impact it can have, and the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing self-care.
And we've also talked about the power of awareness and knowledge. And the fact that you are not alone in this, there are resources available to help you heal and move forward.
And that's actually what we're going to be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So we've talked about what interpersonal exploitation is, how to recognize it, and how to protect yourself from it.
And it's been a lot, right? Like, this is some pretty heavy stuff.
It really is, yeah. But before we wrap things up completely, I'm kind of curious about, the exploiters themselves. Like, is there any hope for them to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's one that a lot of people have, especially if they've been personally affected by exploitation.
Yeah, like it's easy to feel angry and resentful towards someone who's hurt you.
Right.
But at the same time, I think there's also this part of you that wonders if maybe, just maybe, they can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, the audio series we've been looking at, it doesn't really go into too much detail about this particular aspect. But from my perspective, I think the potential for change really depends on a few key factors.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So, first and foremost, there needs to be a willingness on the exploiter's part to acknowledge that their behavior is harmful.
So like, step one is taking ownership.
Exactly.
Recognizing the impact they've had on other people.
And that's often the hardest part, because it requires a level of humility and introspection that can be really challenging for some people.
Especially for people who are used to getting their own way.
Exactly. It's like they have to be willing to step outside of their own perspective and really try to see things from the other person's point of view.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's where therapy can be incredibly helpful. A skilled therapist can help them explore the underlying motivations behind their behavior, develop empathy, and learn healthier ways of relating to others.
Okay, so therapy is definitely a key ingredient in this process of change. But is it always successful? Like, can anyone change if they put in the effort?
That's a tough question, and I think the honest answer is that there's no guarantee. The success of therapy really depends on the individual's commitment to the process and their capacity for change.
So while there's always hope, it's ultimately up to the exploiter to choose that path of growth and transformation.
Exactly. And as we've discussed throughout this whole deep dive, your primary focus should always be on protecting yourself, creating healthy, fulfilling relationships with people who value and respect you. You can't control someone else's behavior, but you can control how you respond to it and what you allow into your life.
That's such a powerful reminder.
Right.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to fix someone or change them. But ultimately, the only person we can control is ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's actually incredibly empowering because it means that we have the power to create the kind of relationships we want and deserve.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one message you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think if anything we've discussed today has resonated with you, I would really encourage you to delve deeper into this topic. There are countless resources available, whether it's books, articles, podcasts, support groups, therapy, whatever it is that you need to support your journey of understanding, healing, and growth.
Yeah, that's such great advice. So if something's been tugging at your heartstrings during this conversation, don't ignore it. Keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop advocating for your own well-being.
And remember, you're not alone. There are people who care and want to help. Reach out to trusted friends, family members, therapists, support groups. There's a whole community out there ready to support you.
This has been such a powerful and insightful deep dive. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all of your wisdom.
Of course, my pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.